Christmas vacation holiday. I was up in Tahoe, Lake Tahoe, which is in California, and where we had a vacation home with my family. And I woke up one night thirsty and took a glass of water, and that experience happened. It started with a rush of energy coming out of my heart. There was, feeling. It was a love. It was feeling like a love that I couldn't possibly generate. How can I generate this kind of love? It is, and I saw it as a beam, about a couple, 1 or 2 feet wide, of white scintillating light that then exploded and filled the entire visual space, and as if I was seeing the entire universe, which then was identified as me. So all of a sudden, I am that. Wow. I mean, how is that possible? So as you can see, this kind of experience is not something that you can read in a book and understand. It can only be understood if you have this experience, if you live it. And it's exactly what consciousness does. Consciousness is the capacity to know by living what we know, by becoming what we know. So consciousness is a magical property that cannot be defined with anything simpler than itself. And that's why it must be fundamental. It cannot be derivative from matter that has none of these properties. It was so clear after that experience that consciousness must be fundamental, but I wasn't ready to say that because I'm a scientist, and I was brought up with the idea that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain, so it's not even real in the sense that it has no causal power. And so I decided to study consciousness by myself, with help of others, a therapist and people that follow some spiritual traditions. So I went through many types of meditations and so on, and through that process, I had many other extraordinary experiences of consciousness that gave me the contour, so to speak, of what consciousness is. And so through this process, after 20 years, I was convinced that, hey, science is wrong on this count. Science is telling us that consciousness is a phenomenon, a material phenomenon, and that cannot possibly be. And that's when I decided that I have to study this full time, where before I was dedicating 30-40% of my time. About 12 years ago, I decided that's it. I need to do this. And I started a foundation, the Federico and Faggin Foundation, with my wife. And the purpose of this foundation is to understand scientifically the nature of consciousness and understand what does it mean in the narrative of how this universe evolved. Because clearly, if consciousness is fundamental, the universe could not have evolved as inert matter to later on evolve consciousness 13.8 billion years later after the Big Bang. So, consciousness must have had a hand in the creation of this universe from the very beginning. So to me, that meant that the story around the, creation of the universe that science is telling us cannot be correct. Told me that consciousness was even much more than I thought it was. And so after that experience, it was clear that consciousness was something way beyond what science was even hinting at. And I needed to explore it because that experience was so powerful and so life-changing that I could not let it go. It was through this process that I arrived at the conclusion about 20 years later that consciousness must be fundamental. It must be the starting point of reality as opposed to the ending point of an evolution that created us.
So, next to
show me clearly that we are much more than I thought we were. So that experience essentially allow me to see myself as the world that observes itself through my point of view. So I was a point of view of the world that observes itself with that point of view, which is, completely different than what was my sense of self. I perceive myself as a separate from the world, observing the world outside of me. And so I was certainly not the world. I was simply something other than the world. Now I am the world observing myself, and the world is love. The world is joy, is peace, is something that I never felt like that before. So how can I be not only the world, but a world that is so unbelievably familiar at some level, and yet so powerful and incredible. At that time, also, my body was resonating with that experience. So my body was hot, like my cells were completely, all vibrating together. And I saw basically it was a white scintillating light, and I understood that that white scintillating light was the stuff of which everything is made. So everything was in resonance, so to speak, and it was the first unitive experience that I had. I then understood for the first time what was meant for a spiritual experience. A spiritual experience is one that makes you be one, makes you feel, makes you live yourself as one with the world. Because that phrase that I made, it was in the context that matter, what we think of as matter, also is conscious, but not in the trivial way in which we think. What is conscious is not the electron or the atom, but is the field of electrons, the field of atoms. And so the consciousness is a property of fields and not the property of matter, because particles, for example, I said earlier, a state of fields. They're not even things. They're not objects. So, and we are not made of objects. We are made of states. We are information. Really, we are information. The body is quantum and classical information, where a computer is only classical information. So my body can host consciousness because it can communicate with a conscious being, which is quantum, but a quantum conscious being cannot communicate directly with a computer. It has to communicate through a living organism with a quantum to classical transformation, which is of a different nature than what you could do with quantum to classical in a computer, because a bit is simply a complicated classical structure made of many particles, many states which are disorganized. But those states that are disorganized, they can carry, for example, a signal, and the signal can have two states, and then you say this signal represents a bit, a 0 or a 1. But when you go from quantum information to classical information, you have to manipulate at the level of particles and atoms singularly. So you can only communicate with cells, with living cells, which are quantum and classical structures. They are not classical structures. So even quantum computers cannot be conscious like we are, cannot have free will, because quantum computers use only a special part of quantumness, which is the quantumness that maintains determinism. You have to use unitary transformations. Sorry for using a technical term, but it means that it behaves like a classical system. And therefore, a quantum computer can only do what a classical computer can do, but it can do it faster. So that's the only difference between a quantum computer, the way we understand quantum computers, and classical computers.